Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about a topic that is maybe unfamiliar to a lot of our listeners today, and it's the sin of scandal. Now, we have lived in a culture where scandals seem to kind of come left and right, or it seems to be more commonplace these days with things like with Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, and even just some of the abuse that we see with recently in the SBC. So there's a lot of stuff happening with the sin of scandal. So joining me today is Phil Van Dyke. So Phil, thank you for being back on my show.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. So what is the sin of scandal? Like, if you were to give me a definition, how would you describe that to somebody?
Well, so I don't get the definition wrong, I am going to read from the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
And, this is a great resource for anybody, Protestant or Catholic, if you want to know what the church teaches. It's kind of more of like a topical thing. It's not something you read from cover to cover.
Mm-hmm.
If you do, more power to you and congratulations. But here it is. It's number 2284. It says, "Scandal is an attitude or behavior which leads another to do evil. The person who gives scandal becomes his neighbor's tempter. He damages virtue and integrity. He may even draw his brother into spiritual death. Scandal is a grave offense if by deed or by omission another is deliberately led into grave offense."
All right. So I guess when we hear that definition, just to kind of sum it up, basically scandal is when there is an individual, or at least from the definition, individual who kind of becomes a tempter to do something that's going to cause some type of sin, whether it's by deliberately or by omission, causing not only the sin to happen, but causing others to kind of fall into that trap. Okay, so I guess when we think about that definition, you can easily think about, most commonplace, affairs that happen in the workplace or sometimes in the church, where you can have somebody who, for whatever reason, may tempt another person, whether it's kind of a intentional thing, or maybe it could just be just dealing with having these strong emotions and kind of acting on those strong emotions that causes the affair to happen. And then, of course, once everything is kind of found out, then that's kind of, in a way, that's when we would say the scandal happened. But really, the scandal would have happened kind of right in that initial, regardless if the wife, spouse, or whoever, or the community would know about this particular sin that has been committed.
Yeah, so I also think that it's good to know, if we go back to the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus talks about the way we think about sin, and and I guess with say adultery, you're talking about lust, and you're talking about sexual vices. What does Jesus tell us about that? Not even a hint. You can't have any of that in your system if you are going to be considered holy. So I would even argue that the sin of scandal happens way before that. In that, let's say people at your workplace or where you go to school know that you're a Christian. And let's say you're with a bunch of guys, as guys often do, and much to our detriment and shame, we will talk about our relationships, what guys have done in those relationships with the women, and in effect, we disparage the name of the woman by saying some of the things, whether they're true or not, because, sometimes guys want to puff out their chest and say, well, we did this, this, and this, and she's this and that. I would say that the sin of scandal, even from being a Christian, would also be you being complicit and not speaking up and saying, hey, this isn't something we should be engaging in. This woman has dignity. She was created by someone who really loves her. And whether you did this or not, it's not our place to talk about them. Now, of course, we may lose a lot of friends that way, but, I think that once people know, like, if we profess Christ and we start saying or not saying things, like, even on such a seemingly innocuous level, like, we have already begun the sin of scandal, because then people will say, well, they didn't say anything about it, they must be okay with it. So if Christians are okay with it, then it's not that bad, you know?
Yeah, and I think, and you bring up a good point. It's like the scandal is not necessarily, it's that second part in your definition where, others can be brought into it. So
Mm-hmm.
with the example you gave, it's kind of like, well, even if someone's there and they may not have committed the act, they may not have done anything, but because they are participating, knowingly participating, and maybe not saying anything or standing up for this woman, it's kind of like, well, it's like a guilt by association. You're kind of involved in it. So this kind of brings up an interesting topic, because if you think about, I'm going to go way back. I'm going to talk about Bernie Madoff and, the big
Okay.
scandal that happened with him stealing all this money from people's funds. And you think about how crafty someone would have to be to not only cover their tracks so no one knew, no one was tipped off that this was happening, but even if somebody did happen to know that this was happening, they probably weren't going to say anything because this individual is a very powerful individual. We can think about all the crimes that Jeffrey Epstein had committed and how many people kind of stayed silent and just kind of allowed it to gather, because this was an individual who had powerful connections and knew powerful people. So when you look at kind of this idea of scandal, it's that idea that finally when things come to light and finally when justice is served, I think a lot of times the scandal's not necessarily in the person who did it, but it's the how many people were connected to it and didn't stop it before it got this far to the point where everything has been exposed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, like, it all comes down to what people, I would think, would say is mundane, that we give scandal in the mundane more than we do in the big actions. The devil doesn't tempt you right away with something huge like an affair. Like, he tempts you with something that is small, kind of like C.S. Lewis says, the gradual slope. It's not just like a steep incline. Like, every single decision you make either straightens you out or contorts your soul in such a way that it defines who you become.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because you can kind of look at, because there's something else I was looking at, excuse me, where even like when we talk about this idea of sin of scandal, sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to be a person initiating it, but it can become something that can be institutionalized. It's something
Oh
that could
yeah.
be part of policy or laws. And I think when we talked about a couple of weeks ago when me and Michael were talking about the idea of politics in the church and just pulling up that political thing about the rise of the religious right, and one of the big things that had to do with not only the whole segregation laws, but you look at Bob Jones University, who, well, we don't want black kids coming to our school, so we're going to set up a private school and we're going to call it a Christian university, but then we still have the power to kind of basically admit who we want to come and attend our school. And then eventually in the 70s, when Nixon is starting to say, hey, we're going to crack down in some of these, these nonprofit religious institutions, and we're going to start taking away 501c3 if they're not kind of, being on board and not allowing everyone to have a fair shot, because for me, I heard that the reason was how conservatives got deeply into politics, or Christians got in deeply in politics, was because people are going to lose their 501c3 status or their tax status. But then when you look at the details, it's like, oh, it actually is more focused around race. So then that's why they got involved, so they could keep their 501c3, so they can still continue to, try to have a mostly Caucasian, university. And obviously, Liberty University was the same way back when it was called Christian Liberty University. I think that's what it was called before it was called Liberty University. But yeah, so I mean, when you think about laws and how certain laws changes, if you don't like the laws, sometimes it's like, well, if the law is doing this, then I'm going to act in this way. So I think there's a lot to really explore on this topic. And I think when we talk about sin of scandal, it's not very commonly placed. Like we can say adultery is a sin, or alcoholism is a sin, or domestic violence is a sin. We can really see how scandal can kind of be that almost like that invisible sin that kind of floats around and we don't really know it got our hooks into us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I think that something that people really also need to know is sin is also an old archery term, and that like, you're just missing the mark.
Yeah.
So sin isn't necessarily just an offense against somebody else, like a specific offense against somebody else. It could be when you just say, well, I know what God wants me to do, but I'm going to do what I want to do instead. And I think that the sin of scandal kind of is something that helps unite all the sins essentially to show that we actually belong to each other. And what is God? I mean, God is love and God is, peace and all these other things. But before anything else, God is community. And when we are in heaven, we're going to be in perfect community. And how should we be allowed to be in perfect community if we don't know how to live in perfect community? And the sin of scandal, I think, is a way for us to live in that perfect community. Because once we see that, like, well, if I post this on Facebook and it's full of vitriol and hatred, like, and other people will see it, then what am I doing to build community? Whether or not I think it's righteous, or whether or not the person may or may not deserve it, like, it's not my place to be able to say, well, I am your judge and jury, because that's God alone.
Yeah. And you mentioned the thing about community, which I recently read Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, and in that book, he talks a little bit about those who are disinherited and like the three hounds of hell that they struggle with, which is usually fear, deceit, but then one of them's hatred. And when he talked about hatred, he said a lot of times hatred is basically people making, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically people making assumptions without being in community. And he kind of gives the example of when the Pearl Harbor bombing happened, that there was a lot of people who had a lot of animosity against Asian Americans who were not involved in any of the bombings that happened. But because of their genetic makeup, they were kind of hated on and kind of persecuted in some ways because of guilt of association. But if they were in community and you were able to see that person not as the enemy or looking like our enemy, but somebody who says, okay, this is somebody who is created in the image of God, they are the beloved son and daughter of Jesus Christ, then you have those conversations. And then you would quickly realize that, well, I cannot hate this person because this person is a beloved son or daughter of God, just as I am a beloved son and daughter of God.
Yeah. And something that I was kind of thinking about when you were talking is that, like, when death is finally defeated in the end times, like, the other thing that will be defeated is this notion of other. There will be no other in our eternal life. So how are we supposed to bring the kingdom of God if we don't understand first that we have to demolish this sense of other? And which is why racism is so antithetical to Christ's teaching in the church. And sadly enough, people in the church, because of fear, because of pride, because of hatred, which all of it is caused by this fear, like they believe what they want because they're afraid that it's going to adversely affect them, and really that's all that matters. And I'm just as guilty as anybody else. Like, I don't want to point fingers across the aisle and say, this is all you. Like I still struggle with it. Like I was born into a system and was institutionalized in such a way that I still deal with some of these racial realities. And as much as I can, I try to make amends where I can and try to be better, you know.
Yeah, and go ahead, Bill.
No, go ahead. I was just going to ramble, probably.
Well, that's okay. Well, we all do that on the podcast. But I think sometimes even the scandal is the idea of, because we talked about knowingly and unknowingly, and I want to focus more of unknowingly, because I can remember, I mean, especially living in the South, living here in Virginia, when there was the debate on, are we going to start taking down a lot of these monuments that depict war heroes from the Confederacy. And it was very interesting, the conversations, because on one side, people go, yeah, we need to take them down because they represent racial oppression, which we are still seeing in this country today with, the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd and others, African-Americans, who have been killed without, basically killed without justice. So we see that side of the coin. But then for other people who live down here, they could say, well, no, we shouldn't do that because we shouldn't erase history. And these monuments are part of heritage and it's part of our history. And even recently, there's a historical hotel here in Stanton where it's called the Stonewall Jackson Hotel. It's been called Stonewall Jackson Hotel for as long as anyone can remember. And they changed their name to Hotel 24, even took down the big, gigantic neon sign that said Stonewall Jackson Hotel. And some people were applauding it and other people were absolutely furious over it. So, and I think it's one of these things where it's the scandal's not necessarily in the should we or shouldn't we. The scandal necessarily, to me, if I'm understanding it right, is the lack of people having the conversation, people being able to sit and understand why keeping it is so important and why taking it down is so important. And even if you don't necessarily agree with the person who you're arguing against, at least you walk away with it better understanding their point of view and what this means to them and how this is going to shape them and how it continues to shape them or oppress them in some ways. And I think that's a component that we fail to miss because, again, I think everything is always focused on, well, this is what I believe, this is what I think, and we don't really care about the needs of our brothers and sisters who may think differently or may have a different experience to what a Confederate statue has over them.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to hear that people say, well, you're taking away my culture and heritage by taking these things away. Like, I get that. I see that argument. And I think that most people put it forth in good faith, not knowing that it's actually a bad faith argument. And I would say that the sin of scandal could probably even begin with not being able to test and think critically about things. Because if you think about a lot of these places where statues are being taken down and monuments and other markers are being taken down, like a lot of these are places of power, like courthouses, and they have these symbols of racism that date all the way back to chattel slavery, where people who are going to these institutions are overwhelmingly of minority. Like, if you think about the population, like the Black community, the last I saw, they made up about 13% of our country's makeup, and like they are disproportionately incarcerated. Like, I mean, to the tune of like close to 50% of those that are incarcerated are people who are African American or otherwise people of color, and what does that do to somebody? Like, on top of the fact that the laws themselves are founded in racist ideologies, then
Mhm.
they go and see the oppressor from the beginning of the country, like, or at least like from the Civil War period, like that isn't there for culture and heritage. That's there as a beacon of oppression to say, we have you now, you are ours. You no longer have the dignity that you thought you had,
Mhm.
and I think that's where a lot of people really go astray when they try to think about that, because they don't want to think that they're that bad of a person, you know and I don't want to think I'm that bad of a person, but the fact of the matter is that we live complicitly inside of a system where there are things set up for you guys like you and me to succeed, where guys of different skin tone would be blocked at just about every path. Like, there are a lot of people that don't want to look at that because that makes them look bad,
Mhm.
you know, and or their family, or like that makes them question, like, well, maybe America isn't as great as it really as we thought it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
And it's a never ending cycle, because you just can't really get away from it until you step back and say, wait a second, what do these laws say? What are these statues saying by being in places of power? Like, I'm all for having statues and stuff like that in museums. So you think about the Holocaust museums, like the death camp at Auschwitz is now a museum. Like, it's not meant to be a place of power. Like, it's not meant for Jews to go in and feel the littleness of their humanity.
Mhm.
It's meant to be a memorial to say, this is what happened in the past. This is what we are trying to never let happen again.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's kind of the big thing, because if you want to get rid of scandal's power, I mean, it's about being truthful. It's about being honest. It's about having those difficult questions and being open to hearing the conversation and hearing the side from both people. And I think a lot of times it's not necessarily, like I said, sometimes it can be, the sin of scandal can be institutional.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times when we look at some of the things with injustice and some of the things that may be happening on an institutional level, from the creation of you know, the Declaration of Independence to, because even Martin Luther King Jr. in a lot of his messages, he would always go back to the Constitution, saying, it is good for all men to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So why is it that certain people can have that? Um, why Anglo-Saxon Protestants can have that, but not African Americans, not the Catholic Irish, not the French, but there's,
So
yeah. Go ahead, Phil.
So you bring up an interesting point, because I do know, and I don't want to take away from the Irish Catholic experience in the beginning of the country,
Mm-hmm.
where they were persecuted.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about that is, like, the definition of whiteness has changed over the course of time
Mm-hmm.
to incorporate Irish Catholics, or any other group that looks close enough to our skin tone, to where they don't have to identify by their heritage the way people of color have to identify by their heritage. And that's really one of the more insidious mechanisms within the institution of white supremacy, is that, we people who are white and in power have the power essentially to say, well, these people who were once on the out can now be in, but we're still excluding everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
when we are living in that system, and when we are saying, by or not saying anything, in essentially, like, rubber stamping this system, that's when we give scandal to not only people who are white like us, but also to people of color who are disproportionately suffering. And I'm not sorry if you're mad about that. I used to be at one point, like, I used to care about that, but the fact of the matter is that I have brothers and sisters who are devastated by the system.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until I really started listening to them and their heartbreak and just hearing about their family and or like whether or not they personally experienced it, like it is a collective experience. It's not just isolated. And a lot of these isolated incidents that we're seeing are only coming about because people are being recorded. The fact of the matter is like it's been happening since the beginning of time.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least with our country.
Well, yeah. And I mean, even if you go back to like a Dateline or a 60 Minutes, I mean, there's occasionally an episode where they talk about, oh, here is this person who was in prison for 30, 40, 50 years. And then finally, after so much time has passed, this person is free because the charges that were brought against them were either falsified, or the new evidence that came up was, the new evidence found out that, oh, it actually wasn't this person. But then I feel like any time when I see those stories, it's almost like every time it's never someone who is white, it's always someone who is black. And especially when you get into the story of where it's happening and the time frame, I mean, you can easily draw your own conclusions and can easily say, well, this is the reason why this person was in jail and wrongly accused was because they were, in Alabama. And, it was during the times of segregation or even in the height of the civil rights movement. And it's almost like, it's like,
now.
And again, because someone was able to, law enforcement or whoever were able to take the law into their own hands and, put this person away. And then finally, whether you want to say new evidence came about or finally someone goes, let's re-examine this because obviously there's some things that seem a little dicey. So let's go ahead and double check that. And you go, well, yeah, this person didn't do it. And and that's the thing. It's like, it's great that they are out of prison, but I don't know, again, and I don't know the logistics or the legality, but what type of compensation are they getting? Hey, sorry that you had to waste 30 years in jail. Our bad.
Some places don't even give any compensation at all.
Oh yeah. And I very rarely do I hear anybody give any compensation unless they decide to countersue the state. And then that's when you start getting kind of that's when you start getting into the idea of, okay, now we're going to get compensated. But again, it's not like it's going to be freely given. You're going to have to fight for it. It's like, which again is a whole other issue that's kind of getting away from our topic at hand. So we've talked a little bit about how this happens in society. How does the Senate scandal begin to permeate and kind of start affecting things within the local church?
I mean, I think that the local church is a microcosm of the society at large. So all of these discussions are happening or not happening, and it all starts at the personal level. It's when I'm trying to think how I want to say this. Okay, so let's go back to this idea of purity, and talking about, when guys are doing this locker room talk, it starts at that small of a level and continues to multiply further out from there. So everything that you see in society can be traced back to the personal life, whether it's in the church or not, and I think that the fact of the matter is that most of us in the church are not immune to this. It would be great if we were, but you can start seeing these injustices all throughout because of people's action or inaction.
Yeah, and it's interesting to bring up the idea of purity because when we think about when I hear people talk a little bit about the idea of deconstruction and one of the reasons why they left the church, and some of them will point, especially a lot of women will point to purity culture because it almost seemed like when it came to purity things, it was like they were the ones that were specifically targeted. You can't do this, you can't wear that, you have to be careful what you do or what you wear, because you're going to cause these Christian men to stumble and to have lustful thoughts. And yet, when it comes to the guys, there's nothing. Like, I mean, I can think of all the years, and we've talked about this, a couple of podcasts back, like probably a couple of years ago, when we're talking about the church and sex. And it was interesting because it's like, when it came to me going through youth, not a lot of sex talk, or if there was sex, it mostly was about women. Women, you have to be pure, you have to be modest, and modest is hottest. I think that was like in a Christian bookstore on a t-shirt, modest is hottest. How many girls, a lot of girls got the Joshua Harris book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And we see now he's even condemning his own book and basically told that, please do not put this book out in print. He wrote that when he was like 17 years old. And it's like, wait a minute. So what do you know about purity? You're 17 years old. So you look at all these things, but then even as a campground that I've worked at for many, many years, never once did I feel like after lunch, when the kids were going to crash time, did one of the guy counselors says, okay, gentlemen, I need you guys to stay after real quick. We're going to have to talk about some things. It's mostly like, girls, come back. Your shorts are too short. We're starting to see some belly button from your shirts. Make sure you have long enough shirts. If you're going to wear a bikini, you got to wear a colored shirt. You got to, you have to, your straps have to be at least an inch or 2 inches thick if you're going to wear a tank top. And even if you are wearing a tank top, it has to be a high cut, not a low cut. And, it was like all this pressure. And my response to that is, well, where are they going to buy clothes? Because if I'm a girl and I'm going shopping, I'm going to an Old Navy, I'm not going to find clothes unless I'm shopping in the guy section and I want to dress up like a dude. Then maybe that's where I can get like a tank top that's pretty thick and high up. That's when I can get shorts that are like, below the knees or whatnot. Like it was stuff like that where, I'm rambling here, so I do apologize. I want to make my point.
Fine.
But I also find it so fascinating that, the scandal in itself is that we continue to hold women accountable in purity culture. Men are not held accountable. And even if the man is the one who cheats on his wife, a Christian man, he's the one who has the affair. He's the one who's caught looking at pornography, and it has this fall from grace from church leadership. The blame is still on the woman. Mm-hmm. Well, you weren't having sex with your husband enough. You weren't being a good housewife and taking care of your husband's core needs. You weren't fulfilling his desires. You weren't doing this, you weren't doing that. And it's that statement right there which says, okay, even when the woman does everything right, she stays pure, she's a virgin, she waits till marriage, she gets married, and that's the first time she has sex. And then after so many years, her husband divorces her or has an affair, it is still her fault. And no blame has been put on the man, because the man has never been pushed and says, hey, you have a role in this too. You have to make sure that you get your mind out of the gutter. You have to make sure that you have accountability. You have to make sure that you are also taking care of your spouse's needs as well. Relationships are not a one-way street.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember growing up in the purity culture movement. I got a ring saying that I was going to be pure. I, did the whole nine, but never once were the guys taken aside and say, hey, you not only have to protect your own chastity, you have to protect the chastity of the women around you. And that has done the biggest disservice, or one of the biggest disservices, to women in the church, and I know that a lot of times people get mad about this. Well, I shouldn't be wearing this because the church tells me to, but I don't care. And I do think that there's a kernel of truth in being able to say, like, why are you wearing what you're wearing? Like, are you wearing it to glorify God, or are you wearing it to get attention? Now, at the same time, I don't think that we should focus on it so much that, it becomes legalistic. But again, in this idea that we belong to each other, like if I'm wearing something, and let's say for argument's sake that I have washboard abs, and I'm the complete package when it comes to physical appearance, which, I mean, if you look at me, you know that that's not really the case. But for the sake of argument, let's say that. Like, I have been struck by the fact that, I mean, especially since I've been married, if I go swimming, I don't think that it's good for me to go out and be like, hey, everybody, look at me, like I'm flaunting the way I look without a shirt on, because that could make some other woman stumble, and it could make my wife stumble in the sense that she could get jealous by the way other women are looking at me. And I think that it's essentially, how do we compose ourselves around each other? Should Christian women around men be wearing bikinis? I might argue no, because whether or not the guys are doing their due diligence, like, why would you want to wear it? I mean, now if it's really hot, I'm not going to get into that. Like, I'm not going to get into the legalistic issue of that. My question is, at the heart, like, are you wearing this because you think you look good and you want to impress those around you? Or do you want to, glorify your body and God because, like, the reason why the church, and especially the Catholic Church, says to cover yourself up, men and women, is not because it's dirty, but because it's so valuable. Like, the fact of the matter is like, and any guy that has struggled with pornography knows that, like, once you start seeing women as objects, the holiness of intimacy is shattered. And I heard a priest, Father Mike Schmitz, he's essentially like one of the most popular priests right now, talk about this idea of every time a married couple consummates the marriage, they grow in holiness, but only if they're in a state of grace. And when they're in that state of grace, like, they're renewing their vows every time they come together to say, this is what God has intended for us, and our love for each other is what is it. I mean, it's God given, and it's being grown by God. And if you have lustful thoughts, if you watch pornography, if you do any of that, like, none of that can happen. And I think that it's like this don't ask, don't tell mentality, because nobody wants to talk about the goodness of sex. And because, I mean, like, you can really get into the weeds, and I don't really want to get into the weeds here, but the fact of the matter is like, if you are married and you are with other men or women respectively who are married, like, we should be able to talk about that kind of stuff, and we should be able to communicate that to our children, because, like, think about the sin of scandal and what it means for parents and children by what we do and what we don't do. If I get mad and my daughter sees me get mad at something and I react a certain way, she's going to start to think, oh, well, that's okay to act that way. Or if I tell her that, like, hey, you have to do this because you are the one that has to control your body, because men aren't going to do anything, like, to do it for you. Like, that's me, like, putting all of that on her and causing her to feel shame about her body, And the fact of the matter is I can't protect her from everything, but I have to let her know that when she is growing up, she has dignity, she is loved, she is beautiful, and nothing is going to take that away from her except herself. No man can take that from her. And what I want to instill in her is this idea that she needs to protect herself, not just for her husband, but for herself and for her own dignity. If she wants to wear like if maybe when she's old enough, because she's only 3 right now, like, you know, if she grows up in a society where you can't get anything that, what anybody would call modest anymore, how do you live within that society? Like, how do you bring your dignity into that? And that's what I want to try to show her, is try to show her her dignity and her value. Because if she knows her dignity and her value, she's going to want to do that on her own. And it's not because of any man, because no man really like deserves that from her, I guess, And it's just wild to me.
Yeah. And I think when we, just to kind of really summarize things, how do you kill, I guess, how do you combat against the sin, the scandal? Well, I think, first of all, it's the identity aspect, the recognition that not only am I a beloved child of God, but everybody that has flesh and bones is a beloved child of God, regardless of color, regardless of age, regardless of, opinions. They are a child of God. So I think, we have to start there, that, the respect of, and especially because if I do that, then I'm in community with them. Because you can't be in community when you are against your neighbor. You have to be loving your neighbor. I think the second thing is transparency.
Yeah.
You can't, the thing what makes scandal so scandalous is that it finally comes to light after it has been hidden. But if you start everything transparently, there's a difference between, me being a pastor and me having a porn addiction, and someone finding out about it, a church secretary seeing porn on my computer, as opposed to me being in my office. I happen to go click through email. Somehow I click and I'm now looking at porn, and I go and I talk to my elders and said, hey, I need to tell you guys something real quick, and just explain the situation. Ask for forgiveness. If I feel like I need help or counseling, ask, maybe take a leave of absence, go get help and counseling. But at least I was being transparent, and I was able to admit my wrong and admit the sin that I have committed, and say, hey, here's what happened, and be transparent. Because you can't have a scandal when the person who is committing the scandal is coming clean and is bringing everything to light, instead of the light being exposed into the darkness. And then I think the final thing is that, you talk about the idea, and I think if you combine, actually, I think finally, if you can combine those two, that identity and being a child of God, because there you're going to have your self-worth, you're going to have your dignity, and then also transparency means you're going to be open and honest to not only with yourself, but with others. Then that begins to create a culture that begins to leaves no room for scandal to be able to hide, or scandal to be able to secretly get its hooks into somebody, because everything is being brought into the light.
Yeah. So, I would probably add one thing to that, and that would be humility. Because I think that a humble spirit is kind of the source of all of this. Because if you're prideful, you're never going to admit that you've done anything wrong. It's that sense of humility. And the other thing is with the transparency, and it's one of the many things I love about the Catholic Church. Just the sacrament of reconciliation, and being able to go to a priest and confess your sins, not because, like, God has already forgiven me. I know that. But the fact of the matter is that I have not only sinned against God and myself, I have sinned against my neighbor. And going to a priest, and if need be to the person maybe that I've offended, is one of the greatest graces you could ever receive. And there are even some penitential rites that you can do during Mass, where you say an act of contrition, essentially, and say, I have sinned in what I have done and what I have failed to do. And it's a beautiful prayer, like going through the whole thing, because like when you talk about the fact that you sin, and like when you say that you sin, like you say through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault, and then like you beat your breast each time you say it's your fault, to kind of like to put it out there, to be like, I've sinned against you, brothers and sisters, and I need your forgiveness. I need the forgiveness of the Lord, and I need everybody to pray for me. And I think that being able to like, and when you do that, there's always this danger of it becoming like a rote thing where it's like, oh, well, I'm going to say this and beat my breast 3 times and now I'm good, instead of just kind of sitting back and like thinking about eternity and thinking about the consequences of your actions, and being able to sit in that mystery of what is grace and like why do I deserve it, and as you're getting that grace, is probably one of the most important things that we can really kind of just latch onto, because and it's the other thing, like, and a lot in church, like, we don't want to sit in that mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Like we want to have surety. We want to know that everything that we think is right, and and that is another sin. Like, that is a sin of pride.
Yeah.
And how do we get out of that? Is we have to be humble. We have to admit when we're wrong, and we have to seek forgiveness from God the Father and our community.
Yes.
Not to say that everybody needs to know everything about your life. There are certain people that you should talk to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as a Catholic, I really appreciate the fact that I can go to my priest, or I can go to any priest really, and say, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I go through my sins. I rebuke the sins. And the priest tells me what God has already told me, but it's that physical, tangible grace that I get saying, your sins are forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
Go and sin no more. And then I have my penance, and being able to say, okay, as long as I'm doing this penance in a sense of authenticity, then I am absolved of all of my sin. Whether or not I actually said, because sometimes you might forget something, and then after you go to confession, to be like, oh, I forgot to say that. But the good thing is like in that you say, for all these sins that I have committed and those that I have not said, it's all washed away. So
good.
That's my Catholic soapbox for a second.
That's all right, man. Well, Phil, again, thank you so much. I think this is a great topic, and obviously we could explore a lot deeper and can go a lot longer on this topic. But I think this kind of is a good benchmark to kind of get people to understand the sin of scandal. What was the name of the book again that you had that kind of talked about it? You said it was a Catholic book?
Yeah, it's the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I can show it to you.
Okay, yeah.
This is the 2nd edition. If you want to read it on a Saturday, it's not the light reading you're looking for. But let's say you have a question about, what does the church teach about loving your neighbor? Well, then you look in the index, you find it, and boom, everything you needed to know about loving your neighbor, or anything that the church talks about.
Okay. All right, good. Awesome. Well, Phil, again, it's always a pleasure to have you on my show, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge on this topic.
Thank you so much for having me.
And guys, again, thank you so much for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. Again, if you haven't heard already, I have set up a coffee account that is ko-fi.com / the Scott Stedman podcast. Go ahead. There's some incentives. There's some cool stuff over here. If you love this podcast and would like to support me, again, all proceeds go to the podcast. I do not take a dime for myself. It automatically goes to upgrading equipment, getting software updates and renewals and all that fun stuff. So guys, if you go ahead and check that out, that is kofi.com / the Scott Stedman podcast. Again, there should be a link in the show notes that you can click on as well. And guys, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll have a new podcast for you next week. Talk to you guys later. Bye.